Hello and welcome to the Camera Trial Podcast with me, Michael Sanders, and now as you can see in living colour. This podcast is brought to you in association with Teks, and my thanks to Mike Thomas and the team for helping arrange this conversation. Today sees the launch of the Sony FX6, the latest addition to the cinema line. The FX6 is the FS5 Mark II for the Cine line, and it's obvious from its feature set it's designed to complement its siblings, the FX9 and the Venice. The FX6 has two standout features, built-in RAW output and autofocus that works at high frame rates. And what's interesting is just how complete this camera is going to be at launch. Sony don't appear to have neutered it in any shape or form. It's there, all singing, all dancing from the beginning. Now, because of timings, I sadly haven't had a chance to play with the camera, but I'm delighted to be joined by Richard Lewis, one of Sony's digital cinematography specialists, who I know has had a chance to play with it. Now, we were meant to be at Teks in Harefield, but sadly COVID put pay to that, so Richard joins me over Zoom.
Thank you for having me.
Richard, let's start by talking about where the camera comes from and where it sits in the Cine line.
So it is the junior partner within Cinema line. However, it is an alpha badged product. So this means within Cinema line, we actually have three different individual badgings. That is Cine Alta for Venice, the FX9, part of the XT Cam series, and the FX6, which is part of the Alpha series.
And that's down to where it's produced and what group's involved?
That's beyond my pay grade.
Fair enough. But even though it has its origins in the Alpha stable, it's very much part of the Cinema line. What does that mean in practice?
As we said, it's part of Cinema line. So this means that it shares a lot of similarities with Venice and FX9. Not just the very similar body color, but also the look. So through using Cinetone, S-Cinetone, S709 in the Cine EI mode, but also the way that the menus interact. And the way that they look and the general layout on the side of the camera. It was designed very much as using some of the sort of A7S3 technology, but very much sort of repurposed by our engineering group to suit professional and the way that it's going to be used.
Reading through the specs, it's amazing how much is crammed into such a small package.
It's very small. Yeah. I mean, It's literally sort of that big. It's pretty much similar size to the FS5 Mark II. It's a few tens of grams heavier, so it's 890 grams without the handle, and without battery and lens. So it's a very, very small, very lightweight package. So it's very. When you see it in the flesh, it really looks small.
So it's not a straight implant of an A7S Mark III into a Cinevised body?
Very, very much not. No, it's designed and tweaked, and all of the color pipeline is adjusted. For example, it's completely different in that regard. For example, the A7S3 has 120 frame recording mode. In our case, this is we go up to 60 frame recording mode. So to get the 120 frame 4K, this is a slow and quick mode. The 7S Mark III obviously has some noise reduction. I don't know exactly what it does, but in the FX6, we allow you to control the noise reduction, so you can even turn it off. In Cine EI mode, by default, it's turned off. Right. One of the other key differences is, although the F7S3 has iframe recording, this is down as an XAVCS, whereas the FX6 is a true XAVC recording, and therefore the recording looks just the same. And the format is an MXF format with all the metadata that you get. So it's not an MP4 recording, it's an MXF recording with a lot more metadata, and so matches the FX9. So it's really quite different in many ways.
The sensor's obviously at the heart of the camera, and this is the first time that this kind of sensor has been used in a cinema camera.
Yes, it is. It's back illuminated sensor with copper wiring. And this allows, obviously, the back illuminator gives you one-stop extra sensitivity, and the copper wiring allows the super fast download of images from the sensor to, say, allow not only 4K 120 frame, but with very low smear. Right. But this is first time for quite a while, where we've had completely new design, new sensor. So Venice was one of those. And then FX6 is another one with a completely new sensor, new internal technology.
You mentioned the fast readout and lack of smear. Just how does it compare to the F55, which, as we all know, has got a global shutter?
To be honest, you'll have to try it yourself to see how you think. But it's a very big step forward in the same way that Venice is a very big step forward. So Venice is not a global shutter, but the readout is so fast that it has the effect of a global shutter without any of the downside of a global shutter.
You said that because of the design, the back illuminated sensor gives you an additional stopper sensitivity. So let's talk a bit about that. What is the base ISO of the FX6?
Yeah, in terms of sensitivity, yes, it's sort of base ISO is normally 800 in Cine EI mode, or you can choose ISO 12800. So together with that point, I'd like to mention, the FX6 has what we call dual ISO, whereas the FX9 has what we call dual base ISO. So the FX9, the dual base ISO is 800 and 4000. So what this means, a base ISO means that you get exactly the same performance in both ISO modes. So in Venice, we have 500 and 2500. In the case of the FX9, 800 and 4000. In both those modes, you'll get the same performance, virtually the same noise, same dynamic range, same color. In the case of the FX6, we are saying it's just dual ISO because we're saying the 800 and the 12800, which we class as, if you like, low and high sensitivity, they don't necessarily give you exactly the same noise performance. So we don't call that a base ISO, we call that a dual ISO.
Sensitivity is only one part of the equation, the other being colorimetry. Just how close is the FX6 in look to the FX9 and the Venice?
I've had a small amount of time with the camera, and it seems to me that they match extremely well. So we were just comparing some images pretty much without grading, and they matched very, very well in terms of colorimetry, certainly. However, Venice is a slightly different sensor. It is a different sensor, slightly different colorimetry. So you can't expect the same performance as a Venice, but it'll be very close to an FX9.
We also need to talk a bit about sensor size, because unlike the Venice and the FX9, it's a 4K full frame sensor, isn't it?
It is a 4K sensor, so 10.2 megapixel. So to get 4K, you need to use the whole full frame. So if you like, the sort of Super 35 cutout in the center is an HD cutout in the case of the FX6.
So in practice, that means if you want to shoot 4K, you need a full frame lens.
To get 4K, it's full frame.
And presumably that rules out any kind of B4 2/3 cutout like we have coming in the FX9.
No, because that would only be in HD resolution.
A big new feature of the FX6 is raw output over an SDI, built in without the need for an adapter like the FX9. But we've learned that RAW comes in many flavours. So what is a flavour of the FX6's RAW output?
Yeah, it's a 16-bit linear RAW. It's designed to go to the Atomos Shogun. They will be shipping firmware for the Shogun by the time we are shipping the FX6, and the RAW goes up to 60p. And the other thing to say is when you are recording RAW, you can also simultaneously record your XAVC iframe recording onto your SD card or CFA card. So it'll do both simultaneously.
We'll talk about connectivity later on, but there's only one SDI output on the camera. So I'm guessing during recording you can monitor over HDMI or Wi-Fi?
Yes, so it's got built-in Wi-Fi, so you can connect your phone or tablet or whatever in the usual way with content browser mobile.
It's probably a good place to talk about processing power because there's obviously a lot going on in the FX6.
Yes, it is, yeah. So that's why we're using the two Bions processors. That gives us 4 times the processing power of an FS5 Mark II. So this this is a very serious amount of horsepower.
I mean, it is easy to forget just how much of a camera's performance is dictated by processing power.
Well, you have to think of, particularly when we're doing the autofocus. So, with the new generation of autofocus, you have to be able to focus more when people's faces are sort of twisted. So to catch the eye, autofocus on the side as well as straight on. And the autofocus has to work in 4K 120 frames per second. So that's a vast amount of processing to calculate. Each individual frame where you're calculating the autofocus points.
When we were talking about RAW, you mentioned that it's possible to record XAVC internally at the same time as recording RAW. But leading on from that, it's worth talking about the cards, because the FX9 uses two different types of cards, the SD, XC and compact flash. Is there a difference with what you can do with one type of card over the other?
Well, to go up to 60p, you can use X90 cards, SD cards, the X90s. Above that, you need the CFA cards, compact flash A-type, which are basically the same size but a little bit thicker. So the reader in the two slots in the camera can take either card. You can have you can mix and match types of card in them. But obviously the benefit of the CFA card, you get the higher frame rate recording, and also the download speed is very fast as well with a CFA reader.
Now, of course, the other big headline feature is autofocus at high frame rate. Just how accurate and how fast is it?
For my viewing, it's absolutely staggering that it just doesn't let go of a face or an eye. It's amazing. And compared to the 7S Mark III, then the autofocus has been tuned for professional cinema work. So in that sense, the menu looks very much the same as the FX9, in terms of speed and how quickly it jumps from one focus object to another. So it's kind of a very different setup. It allows much more fine tuning for professionals who will be using this camera compared to, I guess, the people who will use this feature in the 7S Mark III. So it's been very much tuned, and the software is different, particularly for the autofocus, but it really hangs on. It works perfectly in 4K 120 frame, and I've tried it up to very high ISOs and it still works.
That is quite staggering. I mean, it's something I really can't wait to put to the test. But again, it comes back to processing power, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. So I've tried it in, very high frame rate, 120 frame in very, very dark conditions, with 400,000 ISO, and the autofocus still works.
And what's the primary driver that's allowed you to get such good AF in a camera?
This is primarily down to the artificial intelligence that's built into the camera.
We've mentioned the camera is more than just a A7S Mark III in a different body, and of course connectivity is a big difference. Can you just briefly talk us through the onboard connections?
So you've got the usual connections that you expect. You've obviously got a dedicated viewfinder out. You've got SDI, HDMI. You've got a timecode in or out. So it's a BNC connector, and you switch it between in or out. And then on the handle, you have the two audio XLRs, the 3-pin XLRs. And a power cable. It does run on 19.5 volts for an external power supply, the same as the FX9. Plus, it uses the standard batteries, new batteries that a lot of people will already have. Obviously, earphone sockets and that type of thing, built-in Wi-Fi. So quite a lot of connectivity. There's also a USB-C connector. So this is primarily for connecting to your phone, and then you can transfer files via your phone to an FTP site.
And the camera also has quite impressive LUT capabilities, doesn't it?
So you can use standard 3D LUTs that you can generate in RAW Viewer or Resolve or any of your usual tools that you use, and you can import up to 16 of those. So you can, in the same way as Venice and FX9, you can use one of those 3D LUTs at a time, but you can then individually assign on or off, if you like, to the viewfinder, an SDI out, and internal recording.
So more flexibility in the FX9, but the same as the Venice, I believe?
Pretty much. So in that sense, it's the same as Venice.
Let's talk about the physical design, which includes some new weatherproofing and sealing around the buttons.
Yeah. So obviously the layout of the camera is very much influenced by FX9 and Venice, as FX9 was itself from Venice. And we've completely revisited all of the buttons and that type of thing to make them much more dust and waterproof. So we're not saying it's completely waterproof, but it should be much improved from any previous designs to try and keep out as much moisture out of the body as we can, even though the electronics are completely separated from the air inlet and outlet. So from that point of view, obviously there will be no overheating, and I don't know, I never heard the fan come on. So
another feature that comes over from the FX9 that's not on the A7S Mark III is image stabilization. And again, you need to use an E-mount lens for that to work.
So the image stabilization, you have to use Sony lenses, and the optical stabilization has to be turned off. So it needs a Sony lens because the stabilization process needs the focus and focal length of the lens in order to calculate the image stabilization parameters. So those are stored together with the gyro data in metadata, and then that's used by Catalyst Browse to do image stabilization. Yeah, and then you've probably used it with the FX9, and you choose what percentage of crop you want to use, and that obviously determines the amount of stabilization you'll get. So,
am I right in saying this is another benefit of having an MXF file format with the associated metadata?
Precisely, yes. So we're recording exactly the same parameters as we do in all the professional camcorders with an MXF specification.
So leading neatly onto that is another new feature, the clip flag. So just how does that work and what's its function?
So you have a clip flag button, so you can select as a good shot or a not good shot, and this also works in playback as well. So you can annotate a file or a clip while playing it back, so you don't have to do it actually at the same time. Right. And then within Catalyst Browse, you'll get an extra column that tells you the status of that flag, and you can sort by that flag. So you, for example, if you've marked shots that are no good, you've put an NG, then you can sort them and get rid of those NG takes. So if you have a bad take, you can get rid of them.
And do you know if there's any plans to make that metadata available in other NLEs like Final Cut or Resolve?
Generally speaking, what happens is we make that process available to other manufacturers, and it's up to them whether they choose to use it or not.
Right.
In the same way with Resolve, we make all of the information available to Resolve, but they don't necessarily use all of it.
Richard, thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you today.
It's been a pleasure.
So there you have it, some really interesting nuggets of information about the FX6. I can see myself using it as a B camera to my FX9. Perhaps you can see it as an A camera to your A7S Mark III. I hope to have my hands on one very soon, so look out for a future episode where we will discuss it in more detail. My thanks once again to Mike and the team from Teks. I hope you've enjoyed it. Do let me know what you think. I'll be back soon with another podcast, but for now, goodbye.